I do not really make a secret out of the fact that I like horror. Movies, comics, games, whatever you give me, I gladly consume it. I enjoy both Western and non-Western stories, and usually find that different genres cater to different tastes of horror. Of course, it's unavoidable to have some favorite types, and if I had to choose right now, I'd probably say 80s horror movies, Japanese horror movies, and comics as well as psychological horror from all over the world. Though I usually keep an open mind concerning genres, when it comes to horror games, there is one particular game type that I more or less consciously avoided for a long time. I have played all sorts of horror games, first person, third person, over the shoulder, RPGs, point and click and so on. But I have never entered the realm of the visual novel games. The reason for this might seem pretty silly to some people, but I will try to explain it here. As many people born in the late 80s, I grew up with anime and manga in my life. We were pretty much deeply influenced by shows such as NGE and the Battle Angel Alita anime movie. This influence also led me to reading manga and other Japanese works of fiction, which later actually developed into quite a passion for Japanese novels and comic books. However, along that road, I never really came across any visual novels. The only time I can remember even seeing a visual novel as a teenager was some porn game that somebody had at a LAN party. So, you might say my interest in them as carriers of worthwhile horror stories was not really peaked. I regarded them as just the typical weeaboo games full of cutesy acting weird girls that look like they are 13 years old and act too often more annoying than interesting. If you like this kind of manga or anime character, fine. But for me, I never had a great interest in these types of characters. At least not anymore after my teenage years were almost over. Strangely though, if I would have been aware of the great variety of visual novel games, I probably would have tried them earlier. I not only love RPGs, but when I was younger I was very much into the pick a path kind of novels, where your actions result in certain outcomes and you flip the pages accordingly. At some point it would have been just natural for me to try a visual novel, at least after they became more famous in the West. But I guess I was busy with other stuff. That however changed last year, when I tried my hands on Until Dawn. While not being a visual novel game, it reminded and actually convinced me that the act of playing a sort of hybrid media as an interactive game is a totally valid way to experience great horror. It still took me a while until I decided to try one, but just last month I decided to pick one up. Spirit Hunter NG on Steam. Why this particular one? Well, I didn't want to find accidental spoilers, so I looked for a game that is rather new. And further, a quick glance at the scores on Wikipedia gave me at least hope that this was one of the better representations of the visual novel horror franchise. Now that I finished the game and went through it some more times to get all the possible endings, I have to say it left me in a quite confused state, which may or may not influence any future decisions to purchase another visual novel game. To explore this feeling a bit further, here are my mostly spoiler-free thoughts on the first visual novel game I ever played. Spirit Hunter NG. The story of Spirit Hunter plays in the year 1999, a good year for horror games I might add, and starts with an introduction to our main protagonist, whose name you can pick yourself, though story-wise he has an assigned name. A young troublemaker who lives alone in a tiny apartment number 203. Just 2 years prior, after his mother passed away, he was adopted by his rather well-endowed aunt Natsumi. As an author and a barkeeper, she's quite busy, and to help out his aunt, the protagonist takes care of his little stepsister Ami. One day, on his way home with Ami, he notices a black postcard in front of his door, which after some detective work reveals the words, "Let's play." Not really sure about the message, they proceed inside to have a meal. A few days later, Ami asks her brother to help him out to pay her respects to a deceased friend of hers by gathering some flowers and offering them to the place where she was killed by a hit-and-run car driver. After they put down the flowers, a ghostly figure appears out of nowhere, warning Ami to run away or be killed. And suddenly, out of nowhere, a car drives quickly towards them, threatening to hit them both. The two barely survive, and very distressed return back to the protagonist's apartment. After hearing some strange noises from the bathroom, the protagonist rips the doors open, only to find an empty bathroom, with only Ami's headphones lying on the floor. In panic, the the protagonist tries to figure out what to do next, when he hears the distant melody of a flute of some kind. Without a rational thought in his head, he runs out of his apartment, following the sound. There, he meets a strange girl dressed in traditional clothes, and obviously not from this world. Her name is Kaguya, and her game has just begun. From there on out, it is your turn to investigate different spiritual occurrences and to figure out how to retrieve Ami and ultimately defeat Kaguya. On your way, you are assisted by your best friend, a young Yakuza member called Amanome, Hasuki, an idol with an occult fetish, and an assortment of other characters who will join you later along the way. Since this is my first visual novel, I expected it to consist mostly of reading and clicking one button to go to the next dialogue box. But contrary to my expectation, there are quite a lot of interaction possibilities during the so-called investigation sections. You use your flashlight to shine on objects you want to inspect or interact with. This can either lead to completely mundane commentary, or maybe you find an object you can take with you. Here you can also inspect your inventory or look at any files you have. The files contain some of the most interesting and important information in them, so don't just take them as flavor text. During dialogue, you also get the option to react to certain things your companions say to you. This option never changes, and you are always presented with the same 5 responses. Also, during dialogue, you are sometimes given options to decide what to do next. Besides the dialogues and investigations, you also have situations that are named crisis choices. If you or your companions are in some kind of threatening situation, a countdown appears that counts towards 0. Right choices either bring you to the next choice or end the sequence. Wrong choices subtract from the countdown, and if it reaches 0, you fail. Another sequence is the survival escape, usually happening in conjunction with a spiritual encounter. If you make the wrong choices here, or do not use the right items, you end up dead and game over. This mode, however, doesn't have a timer and feels a bit less urgent, though the game developers try to stress you with all the weird imagery and hectic music. Your failure and success in the challenges that the game throws at you are all dependent on how thorough you look for items and study the files and dialogue sequences within the game. Using certain items will result in the destruction of the spirit, while others will purify the spirit's soul. So, it's important to gather all necessary info and really look everywhere before challenging a spirit. The game offers 3 different kind of endings, with some slight variations depending on certain choices during the game. How well you perform and who you manage to save during your playthrough will determine the game's ending. And this brings us to my personal experience with the game. What did I like? What did I not like? I have to be frank here, I have quite mixed feelings about the game, and I actually suspect it's not necessarily the game's fault, but the visual novel genre itself. But let's first look at some of the good points. The atmosphere is great. Spirit Hunter NG is quite good at setting the mood, especially during the investigation portions. With its narrow view and focus on the flashlight, as well as random scares and sound cues, it can really make me nervous at times. The overall story is good too. It made me feel like it's a mix of Japanese horror with elements of poltergeist thrown into it. Though, I first thought it all seemed a bit random and disconnected from each other. But in the end, it somewhat came all together, and from about the halfway mark, some things started to make more sense. The artwork is mostly great too. To be honest, when I first saw Hasuki's character at the very beginning of the game, I feared that the artwork would suffer from a focus on the cutie, girly character. But the set pieces and many of the death scenes are great. The other characters are also designed very well, and the often switching facial animations help the visualization a lot during dialogues. The one weak point here, which I have to point out, is that some of the spirit designs did not really resonate with my sense of horror. Especially one particular spirit started off pretty good when you only got glimpses of her, but then when you actually get to see her in full, it just made me laugh because it looked so weird. There is a mini game within Spirit Hunter NG in which a mysterious man called the D-Man contacts you now and again with clues to find cards that he has hidden all over the places you visit. While this is not mandatory, I really liked the treasure hunt feeling it gave the game, and it was difficult but quite fun to hunt down all the cards. Let's talk about some things I didn't like about the game. First, many of the companion characters are not for me. Hasuki, the goth occult idol character, is definitely not for me. Her design is great, but a lot of dialogue with her is just straight out boring. I was even tempted several times to skip the dialogue with her just to get to some better parts of the game. They really make her out to be this naive, typical idol stereotype with an occult twist, but she never seems to shed that characteristic completely. I was always under the impression that Japanese idols are more playing a character in public and not behave like this when the costume and makeup come off and they just hang with their friends. Maybe I'm wrong, who knows, but it is definitely not for me. And when one doesn't enjoy such a central character to the game, a lot of the dialogue just becomes boring as hell. Amanome? Amanome? On the other hand, was definitely more entertaining. Trying to seduce the protagonist's stepmom and casually threatening and intimidating people around him, it is almost too ridiculous to take serious. But then again, if something happened to him, why should I, as the representation of the player character, care? He doesn't really seem like a very moral person that I would really invest emotions in. Though he is funny. Of all the characters that you team up with throughout the game, there was really only the police officer Reina Oe that I really liked. Dialogue with her was fun, she had a lot of character and seemed like someone who breaks the rules and kicks ass when necessary. The rest of the characters, not so much. When it comes to the dialogue, there's one thing that really bugged me. Throughout the whole game, they offer you these emotional responses to certain things. I first thought this had some kind of effect onto the course of the dialogue or later outcome of the game. It turns out it doesn't matter at all. It just changes the immediate response, and yes, you won't get all the character info cards if you're not super positive to everyone, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't affect the story at all. And finally, one huge factor that makes me feel a bit unsure about the game is the nature of a visual novel game itself. It seems to me that replayability is basically non-existing, or at least not worth it in Spirit Hunter NG. After playing once through the game, I made use of the L1 button to skip over all the dialogues just to try out what happens if I decide something else here or there. And after I found 2 out of the 3 possible endings and didn't know how to get the last ending, I looked it up in a walkthrough. Even the walkthrough stated clearly after the first finish, just hold the button to skip all the dialogue. What is the point of playing a game if all I do is jump over the main element of the game just to make some different choices? For me, this brings forth a strange feeling towards this game. When I buy a game, I usually enjoy attempting it again and again and again and messing around with certain things and try out new things. But a visual novel game like Spirit Hunter NG does not give you that possibility. So basically, once you finish the game, it doesn't do anything else. There's nothing different. All the good dialogue is still good, but old, and all the tedious dialogue becomes even more tedious the second time around. So I just skipped it all. You might say that point and click games are in principle suffering from the same problem, and while that to some extent may be true, I feel that the greater level of interaction you have with those games hides this much better than the visual novel can. Also, on a side note, one of the endings feels like it's missing a part or so. I know it's done on purpose, but I don't think that part will ever be resolved. All in all, from my first experience, I can say that there are some factors which are very decisive, at least for me, to have a good visual novel experience. The majority of the characters should be interesting, the choices need to be more meaningful, and the endings must feel more impactful. I definitely did not hate the game or anything like this. When it's good, it's very good. But at some point, I almost wanted to quit when it became more tedious than rewarding of an experience. I am definitely open to try more visual novels at some point, but just some elements of this game somehow make me worry that any future attempt will just be as mediocre. Maybe you have to be in the right mindset to fully enjoy the experience, or maybe it is not targeted for people my age, though the frequent portrayal of violence makes me think otherwise. Anyways, if anyone out there knows of a better game that I could try in the future, I am open for any suggestions. I will keep my eyes open and will follow the development of the latest installment of the series, which will be released in 2021. Maybe I will be convinced to give the genre another shot when the next one arrives.